and your life.
Good afternoon and welcome to Gulf Specimens Friday live stream. And today we're going to be talking about colonial animals, which is really kind of hard to explain. But essentially, colonial animals are a number of different individuals that are all connected. They're all genetically identical, and they live together to form a recognizable structure. Okay, probably the best examples and the most studied examples of colonial organisms are corals. And corals are essentially a colonial anemone. If you had a bunch of anemones that were all connected together and they built a little skeleton around themselves, then you essentially have a coral. So it's lots of small individuals all connected through a layer of tissue that unites them, and all of them genetically identical. So I want to take a look at those first, and I'm going to look at this one, which is being very uncooperative right now. I think we've shown you these before, but this is a soft coral, and if you look very closely, you'll see all these little brown dots, and each of those little brown dots is a tiny little polyp, very much like a tiny little sea anemone. These are the feeding organisms for this colony, this kind of branched, what we often refer to as a sea whip or a sea rod, is the colony. And people recognize the colony form, and oftentimes the species is recognized by that particular colony structure. Now, let me talk a minute about the advantage of being a colonial animal, because being a colonial animal is most advantageous in reproduction. Most marine organisms reproduce both sexually and asexually in some manner. Colonial organisms propagate essentially asexually. Now, oftentimes they may have individuals that give off eggs and sperm, but their major means of reproduction is it grows new individuals, okay? And I'm going to bring you over here to the hard coral to kind of talk about this a little bit. There are some coral colonies that we know on the Great Barrier Reef and on other reefs that are tens of thousands of years old. Another advantage to being a colonial organism is you may have some individuals that die, like on this one. Most of this part of the coral colony doesn't have any live polyps anymore, but up here where it's nice and orange, those are still surviving, and it will try and establish the colony with this live growing area. The thing about being a colonial animal is that if the environment is suitable, then you can reproduce very, very quickly. You don't have to wait to form eggs and sperm. You don't have to wait for a particular season in which your larvae are going to thrive. So as far as taking advantage of a suitable environment, being a colonial organism is really, really handy. Now I'm going to show you another coral, and I think we can get it here, most of it in the water, but we can see where some of the polyps over here have died. Okay, but that's not keeping the rest of this colony from being perfectly healthy. And on top of this hard limestone skeleton is a little pink skin that is connecting all of these polyps to one another, so that if These polyps over here get caught in a current with lots of food. They will catch that food and digest that food and share it with all the others in the colony through that tissue that they share together. So, very, very important in many different marine groups. Now, there are a couple of groups that don't show any colonial forms. Echinoderms, for instance, sea stars, brittle stars, sea urchins. There aren't any colonial echinoderms that I'm aware of. So if you know of one, send me a note, because I'd like to study up on those because they're very interesting. But corals are probably the oldest known and best studied of all the colonial organisms. And they reproduce almost entirely asexually when they find themselves in a favorable environment. Once a year, they produce eggs and sperm and reproduce sexually, and that gives rise to new colonies. But it's hard to find a spot on a coral reef if you're a larval coral to start up a new colony. So this is their primary means of reproduction, and it's where they're most successful in being a colonial creature. Now, there are two other groups of animals that tend to form colonies a great deal. One of those is the Bryozoans, and one of those is the Tunicates, or what we call the sea squirts. And I want to talk about the Bryozoans first. And I'm going to go over here. And I have the remnants of a Bryozoan colony here. That if you could see this, and here's another dead, entirely dead colony right here. This one washes up on our beaches all the time. This one also washes up. These usually start life by having a few of the organisms, the zooids, settle on something hard, and then they begin to bud off new individuals, new zooids, and the colony grows and grows. And in this case, it gets this real ruffly kind of colonial structure. Look at it really closely, you would see lots of little, I'll show you this picture, because Bryozoans are going to look a lot to you like a little anemone. Here you can see the colony structure. Each of these little compartments houses an individual zooid, an individual little Bryozoan. And each of these little compartments has a tiny little round door that they can open and close. And when the door is open, this little U-shaped set of tentacles comes out and forages in the water, just like the tentacles of a little coral polyp would forage in the water, hoping to run into some plankton. And when they do, they pull that plankton in and digest it. And once again, there's tissue that connects every one of these little individuals into the same colony. This picture underneath there is a shot that's kind of straight down on top of the colony, where you can see each little individual set of feeding tentacles in the Bryozoan. Now, Bryozoans often have this habit of growing over things. We call them encrusting Bryozoans, and that's how these all get started. These grow around seagrass oftentimes, or they may grow around sea whips, and it looks like they've got this kind of a little tubular structure. That's basically because they built their skeleton around something else. But you also get forms like this one that are branching forms. And the neat thing about this one's called Bugula, is that these look a lot like red algae. Most people, when they first collect them, think it's a marine algae of some sort, but it's a little stiffer than a marine algae. And if you get out your microscope and you take a look at it, on each little branch, you'll see like a little house with a round opening at the top, and coming out of that little round opening are these little tentacles that it uses to feed with. Now the tentacles are not exactly like you find in coral. There aren't any stinging cells on these tentacles, and they have cilia and grooves that as they collect the plankton, they can pull it down into their digestive system and digest it. Here, if you look at this picture, you can see the little tentacle crowns coming out of each section of that branching bryozoan. Now, this one is very special to us here at Gulf Specimen, because this is one of the first specimens that Jack Rudlow sold to researchers who were looking for compounds that might be useful in fighting cancer. And this organism gave rise to a whole group of anti-cancer drugs, and that we are still using today to fight a number of different cancers. So this one has been very special to us. We don't have any live ones right now because these are more a winter organism. We get more of this in January and February, sometimes into March, but you just don't find it usually in the heat of July. So these are the bryozoans. Bryozoans are always colonial. You don't have any solitary individuals. Okay, unlike this next group that we're going to look at, and those are the tunicates. And any of you who've ever visited us here in the Gulf Specimen Aquarium and Lab have probably seen some of this stuff here. And you may have seen it washed up on our beaches if you've gone to Port St. Joe or Cape San Blas or St. George Island or even St. Augustine and around Jacksonville. Sometimes some of this gets washed in and nobody ever knows what it is. I've heard this called all kinds of different things. Some people think it's, gosh, I've heard dolphin pancreas. You know, because people make up really fanciful stuff because they don't have any idea what it is. But this is a colonial tunicate that we refer to locally as sea pork. And I think that's because these really light varieties reminded people of salt pork. There's no pork anywhere in this organism. Never seen a pig, never going to see one. No pork. But there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of tiny little sea squirts embedded in this thick outer covering, which is referred to as the tunic. And the tunic is very, very thick. Now, I cut into one of these earlier today to see if I could see the individual zooids, and I can't make out anything that is a single individual. I see some dark areas there where they might have been digesting food, and I was hoping to find little siphons, little tubes that extended up to the surface that I could actually show you. But clearly the little zooids individuals in here are very tiny without a microscope. But these are colonial animals, but you also have tunicates that we often refer to as sea squirts, because when you pick them up and squeeze them a little bit, they squirt water. And they do that because each little blob of tunicate has an in-current opening and an ex-current opening, and water comes in and it passes through this little basket that is made of what's left of their gills, and then it passes back out the other opening. So if you pick one up and it's been full of water and feeding, and you squeeze it a little bit, oftentimes it's going to squirt out the excurrent opening. These colonial forms, even though we call them colonial sea squirts, they don't squirt. You can pick them up all day and squeeze them and nothing happens. Okay, but I wanted to show you these animals. I'm coming back over here. These animals are actually a very primitive chordate. Now, all of the world's vertebrates, fish, frogs, reptiles, birds,
people,
all of us are chordates. And at some point in our life, we all have a stiff cord running down the back called a notochord that in people and frogs and fish turns into the vertebral column. And they also have, running right along that notochord is a hollow nerve cord. Most invertebrates have their nerve cord on their belly side rather than on their back side. But in the sea squirts, their larval form looks very much like a little tadpole. It's not as big. I mean, this is a comparison that shows you a frog tadpole and a larval tunicate, and they look a whole lot alike, except this is actually much smaller. Okay, about an inch long usually, sometimes only a quarter of an inch or a half an inch, but they have this big bulbous head, and they have gills right in behind here, and they have this stiffening rod, the notochord, and right underneath there, they've got a hollow nerve cord, just like in our little frog or in a larval fish, all of which look very, very similar. Now, what happens in the tunicates is that this little guy will glue his head to the bottom or something on the bottom that's hard, and this big long tail will get reabsorbed, and his notochord disappears, and his dorsal hollow nerve cord disappears, and his primitive brain disappears, and basically all that's left of this is this little head-like blob with the gills. And he develops an opening on this side that pulls water in, and an opening on this side that lets the water back out. And so he pulls water in, filters it over the gills, takes out any food, and then squirts it back out the other side. So there are lots of different forms of colonial tunicates. There's one in the Keys that's like jet black with looks like little orange flowers in it, and that one is fairly common. There's one in New England that looks kind of like this, and it has a very light background color, but you can see each little tiny zooid, and each little zooid has an in-current tube opening where water comes in, and then an excurrent opening that squirts into this common area where they share a opening to the outside. Some books say they share an anus. They don't really. They share an excurrent opening where all the water and any waste products come through this central part. But they are arranged usually in a circular or oval kind of structure, so that each little individual zooid has its own area. And once again, if this gets damaged, okay, they can heal over where the damage is, and they can start to grow in another direction. Once again, taking advantage of a similar favorable environment. And this is just a couple other sea porks that are common in our area. We get this white one with these little, here you can see the little flower-like arrangements of zooids. This one, we get them pink and purple. And I'm going to go over here to this other this other tray here, and you can see on this pin shell right here and right here we have sea pork or Colonial tunicate colonies that have grown on this pin shell in turtle grass areas. Okay. Okay, Allison, do we have any questions?
No, but I do have a question.
Okay.
How long do colonial animals usually live?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And there are some researchers who think that some colonies, the colony may have a lifespan. And apparently there are some tunicates, for instance, where the whole colony comes and lives through a season and dies in a year or two. And then there are others that we know of that have lived for at least 30 to 40 years. And then there are those that people feel like may just keep living as long as they can add new individuals. The older individuals may die off, but new individuals are born, and we know, or formed. We know that happens in the corals. They don't, after 20 years, the coral doesn't die. Okay, as long as the conditions are favorable, the new individuals are healthy and thriving, and maybe parts of the old colony have died off. But sometimes even very old parts of the colony may be alive. They're sharing food. They may not have those things that cause aging in other organisms. So, really good question.
Okay, so Brian has a question. If the colony gets broken in half, will both pieces survive?
Oftentimes, both pieces will survive. It kind of depends on what happens to the colony. Like if the colony gets rolled around in the mud and each little zooid, their little openings get clogged up, then it may kill that whole part of the colony or the whole colony altogether. But oftentimes that is a way that they propagate, is that when they get damaged or injured and broken into pieces, each piece continues to live.
Okay, Brian has another question. Who eats tunicates?
Ooh, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure. I have heard that there are some human civilizations that eat some tunicates. Most, however, are apparently not eaten except by things like amphipods, eat them when they wash in on the beach.
Crabs?
I know, probably crabs. I don't know for sure, but yeah, probably. We cut one in half and it's really all slimy and icky on the inside. I don't think I could. I don't think I would be tempted to eat it myself.
They serve them in Korea too.
Do they?
Mm-hmm.
How do they prepare them?
It's like sashimi. They eat them raw.
Oh.
It's pretty good.
All right.
Okay, Ryan says that, sea turtles, I think, are chemsrelease, eat tunicates.
I have heard that hawksbills eat a lot of sponges, also eat tunicates, and I'm sure that chemsrelease may give them a little nibble every once in a while too.
Good. All right, and that's all we have for questions.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Keep watching Facebook, and we make all of our announcements about new programs, etc. And if you have further questions, write them in on the Facebook page, and we'll get to them as soon as we can.
All right, thank you guys.